But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Welcome to episode 11 of the Exit Your Matrix show. So, as we have been doing in the past couple of episodes, we're going to continue with quotes from Lysander Spooner's book, Vices Are Not Crimes, A Vindication of Moral Liberty. Here we go with section 3. To know what actions are virtuous and what vicious, in other words, to know what actions tend, on the whole, to happiness and what to unhappiness, in the case of each and every man, in each and all the conditions in which they may severally be placed, is the profoundest and most complex study to which the greatest human mind ever has been or ever can be directed. It is, nevertheless, the constant study to which each and every man, the humblest in intellect as well as the greatest, is necessarily driven by the desires and necessities of his own existence. It is also the study in which each and every person, from his cradle to his grave, must necessarily form his own conclusions, because no one else knows or feels, or can know or feel, as he knows or feels, the desires and necessities, the hopes and fears, and impulses of his own nature, or the pressure of his own circumstances. We're continuing to delve into mind control, but before we get into that, I have some opening thoughts and then we'll do our review. So when we work on and discover ourselves, we have an amazing ability to see and understand things like these mechanisms we're talking about of hierarchy and compartmentalization. In this particular case, we're talking about systems of control and how they're able to do what they do through those mechanisms. It'll be different features if we're discussing something else, but the awareness we regain after decades of indoctrination stays with us, and we come to a state where we start decoding things. It's accessing a set of tools that you can use in your evaluation of any system or organization or person to truly understand what is actually, in reality, going on. Like this. And that indoctrination I mentioned earlier, don't be fooled. This is by no means accidental. And I know for most people that's hard to accept and very unsettling, and I get it, and I was there at one point. But it has very specific goals, and it's deployed with sophisticated techniques and requires considerable resources, and it's a form of mind control. So I want to pause here and stress something that I've spent some time on in previous shows, and that is, in my opinion, the condition of the mind is the most important issue out of everything we cover. A receptive mind is a prerequisite to the acquisition of this knowledge, but all sorts of things start to happen as a result of these changes. You begin to see patterns, sources of knowledge and information begin to present themselves. You come across subjects, really meaningful subjects, that you previously would have had zero interest in, but now you're fascinated with, and they feed a reinvigorated curiosity. So of course I'm of the belief that natural law and objective morality are critically important, but even more important is keeping the mind in that state of receptivity. So if one arrives at the acceptance and adoption of natural law and objective morality, let's say, as the proper governing principles of the universe, what next? And don't misunderstand, large groups of people thinking, feeling, and acting consistently with those tenets would create an unbelievably improved experience compared to what we're in now. But even if that could be achieved, would that be it? Is there nothing else of value to be discovered? What about diving into ancient wisdom? We've talked briefly, very briefly, about Hermes and Pythagoras, just to name a few. What about pulling at the threads that increasingly point to the likelihood of periodic, worldwide resets and reject wholly the linear timeline, including the prevailing theory of evolution that we have been fed from birth? What about an exploration of special gifts we don't even know we have and may be able to foster and bring into manifestation? I'm talking about things like understanding auras, to have knowledge of higher worlds, like Rudolf Steiner wrote about, deploying magic. What about nurturing a talent or working to develop one? Or how about this? It's what the universe is craving and I believe will reward. And that's the dissemination of this very material that I'm talking about. That's the reason I'm doing it. What got me to start is Mark Passio's story of his early days, before his podcast and his website, when he was only making live presentations. After one of them, a woman approached him and asked what else he was doing to get the information out. And he answered honestly and said that he wasn't. And then she asked him what right he had to possess that information and not share it more broadly. Wow. That really got his attention, and why he took his efforts to a new level and is doing the show, the website, his presentations, and all that he's doing. And that's why I'm doing this show. So that feels like the perfect segue. Please subscribe, like, or even what I think is the most beneficial action, and that is to share this. Share this with somebody and get a conversation going about it. Okay, let's jump into our review. We've talked about truth and solipsism. And truth is very simply defined as that which has undergone the process of manifesting in reality. It's what has occurred and is occurring now. And remember that truth is belligerent, meaning that it does not, but also it cannot, care about anyone's feelings or their opinions or beliefs about it. It simply is. And truth can be known. But there are those who believe that it can't, and those are engaged in solipsism, which is the adversary of truth and claims that the perception is reality. We've heard that, right? That the self is the only thing known to exist, and anything outside of the self is in doubt. We've also covered cause and effect, and one of the most important things I think that we'll discuss. And I'm talking about true causal factors, root cause. I think we spend so much of our time, if the cause and effect are kind of a spectrum, we spend most of our time on the effect side. We're talking about what's happening in the news, and this is occurring and that's occurring, and these people are doing this and those people are doing that. But we really don't go far enough back to understand the true root cause, and that is critical. And we have to understand root causes at their micro and macro level. So they operate with us in the decisions that we make and how we think, feel, and behave. But they also apply more generally, more broadly, because as you get large groups of people acting and behaving in the same way, that informs the behavior of the group, and you start to feel the effects of that on the aggregate level. So we've also covered aspects of manifested consciousness. This is the Trinity, and we'll cover lots of threes. You'll notice that that's a theme. And this is the combination of thoughts, emotions, and actions that come together. And what's most critical is that there be harmony among them. You can't be thinking and feeling and acting in ways that are contrary to one another without having suffering. Brain structure and composition. We've talked about the base brainstem or reptilian brain, this fight, flight, freeze part of our mechanism that's geared toward survival. And then we have the mammalian brain sitting on top of that, which introduces emotions. And finally, above that, the third component is the neocortex, or the human or thinking brain. And this is what allows us to engage in philosophy and art and creative thinking and have imagination and all those things. And once again, we have to talk about balance, and it's so critically important that we have balance among these three. And we'll talk later about an imbalance to that reptilian brain and what that can cause. Left and right brain. So we can see here what the left and right brain are responsible for, and while that's interesting, once again, it's the importance of balance. That is the critical issue we have to deal with, and that we don't have an imbalance or a chronic usage of the left or right brain. We've covered the two primary forces within all human beings, and those are love and fear. And we feel those in different ways. So love expands consciousness and fear constricts consciousness. And how we feel that internally, if we feel love, is sovereignty or dominion. When we experience love externally, outside of ourselves in the world around us, that is freedom. Conversely, when we experience fear internally, we call that confusion. And fear experienced externally in the outside world is slavery. And a second ago, we talked about the balance between the left and right brain. So we can have worldviews that result from chronic imbalance to the left or right brain. A chronic imbalance to the left brain is going to create a worldview of randomness. And this basically means that there are no rules that govern anything. Everything's up for grabs. We're just neurons firing, and we're meat sacks, and there's no way to tell what's going to happen, or that there is any real order to the universe or to the cosmos. And this results in order giver and a master mindset, and ultimately can devolve into things like social Darwinism. If we have a chronic imbalance to the right brain, this is a deterministic worldview. And this is the thinking that everything is already determined, it's already set out. We see this in a lot of religious traditions where you just leave it up to God because He's in control of everything and it's been written in the good book, so to speak. And this results in order follower and slave mindsets. And if experienced with enough people, on the aggregate, as I was talking about earlier, this can devolve into religious extremism and fundamentalism. But we do have to recognize that those elements of randomness and determinism do exist as they are intended, which is in the universe naturally. So we see that as free will in each of us making our own decisions day to day, and as determinism in natural law, which creates an order for the cosmos. We've covered magic and sorcery. And magic is the science and art of influencing change to occur in accordance with the will. That's capital W will. That's the will of creation, or of the universe, or of the cosmos, or God, whatever you want to call it, or however you want to conceptualize it. Sorcery, on the other hand, is the science and art of influencing change to occur in accordance with the will. Well, that's exactly what I just said, right? Except in this case, sorcery is serving the lowercase will, the egoic will, the self-interested will. We recently covered the 4 barriers to self-realization, the first being the 5-sense illusion. This is the ideology of understanding our experience solely through the lens of 5 senses, only that which can be experienced through sight, smell, touch, sound, or taste. The second is ego identification. This is the misapplication of ego. And ego is simply a mechanism that allows us to see ourselves separately from everything outside of ourselves. The classic example is, I know I need to nourish myself by putting food on a spoon and putting it in my mouth, not in your mouth. It results in us seeing the roles that we play in the physical world when we're in ego identification. So I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, rather than having the awareness that I'm simply consciousness having the experience of those roles of a doctor, or a father, or whatever it might be. The third barrier is the prison of the left brain. And this is thinking dominated by the physical world, by stuff, by matter. It doesn't allow for the proper participation of the mammalian brain, and because the mammalian brain is responsible for emotions, which are our moral guidance system, the signals the brain receives are missing a moral component. And this was our first foray into a new topic, which is mind control, which is a characteristic that all participants of institutionalized belief systems share. And before we go any further, I want to reiterate again, you should definitely reach out and get Mark Passio's ARC drive. This is a 2 terabyte drive that he puts his basic private collection of all his best information on, and you send him a blank disk, he sends this back to you with all of these files, thousands and tens of thousands of audio, video files, books. And this is really, it truly is the amazing repository of knowledge. And I would suggest that you would really do yourself a favor by getting this and delving into it. It will definitely open your eyes. We're continuing with a discussion of control structures, how they are organized and how they function. And in the last episode, we talked about 2 key mechanisms that make them effective, and those are compartmentalization and hierarchy. So compartmentalization, again, is division within the organization to limit knowledge amongst its participants. And hierarchy is setting up the organization like a pyramid, with very few people at the top who have a significant amount of knowledge about the organization, such as its goals, methods, backing, but mostly the larger picture. And then as you move down the organization, there are greater numbers of people with less knowledge. These are the 2 basic structural components of any organization or construct rooted in control. Business entities of all types, government, military and law enforcement, education, intelligence agencies, media, entertainment, political structures, and the list goes on. As I talked about last time, compartmentalization and hierarchy act as leverage. They are powerful, and the reason we know very little about how they work is that that information is occulted. And always remember that the word occult is synonymous with the word hidden. Nothing more and nothing less. These are systems of control. And here's an amazing quote with some shocking insight. The authoritarianism inherent to this structure is antithetical to the concept of the rights and liberties of the individual. Most individuals, bound by secrecy-prone hierarchical values, will, over time, lose the ability to display free thinking, engage in civil discourse, and even be able to envisage the notion of freedom. Now that's pretty shocking. I think we need to read that last part again. Most individuals, bound by secrecy-prone hierarchical values, will, over time, lose the ability to display free thinking, engage in civil discourse, and even be able to envisage the notion of freedom. Participants in these systems are operating from the base portion of the brain, which is the reptilian brain or brainstem we were talking about earlier. And we know that this is the portion of the brain responsible for survival. This is the world as a hunter-hunted scenario and a zero-sum game. I best kill so that I'm not killed. If you eat, I don't eat. If there's a resource that goes to you, it can't go to me. If I hold the knowledge, I can prevent you from using it to do something against my interests. These systems are also deeply rooted in fear. And with very few exceptions, its members are in the interesting position of being both slaves and masters. Because with very few exceptions, these people are taking and following orders from above, but also giving and enforcing orders to those below. Ultimately, their effect is mind control. And I know there is significant resistance to the idea that mind control exists outside of something like Nazi Germany or Jonestown. And as a quick aside, And to test how willing you are to re-examine a belief, how about this description of what may have gone on at Jonestown?
Jonestown was another example, I think, of an entirely created situation. Jim Jones had connections with the CIA. He was using a variety of very sophisticated control techniques. And when they threatened to blow the lid in the media on what he was doing, he moved the whole operation into the jungles of Guyana. I talked to air traffic controllers who said that on arrival, the people taken off the planes there that were black adults were bound and gagged on the way to Jonestown. I talked to people who lived 5 miles away in the jungle, didn't know a single black was living in Jonestown. The only people allowed in and out were a white elite. You call them the basketball team or the guards. These people were allowed to have money. They were allowed to have weapons. They had the best food at the camp. They were allowed to come and go. The blacks and the women, the elderly and the children were being drugged daily. They had basically a concentration camp, and they were developing it with drugs. But the drugs were left behind, and they were the same drugs that were part of MK Ultra. The haloperidol and the truth serums and all of the control drugs. One Foot Locker had 11,000 doses of Thorazine as a control drug that they used. These people did not die of cyanide poisoning. They did not drink cyanide. If they had, they would have shown 2 indisputable signs of cyanide pathology. Spasming of the limbs, because you're getting interference for the messages from the brain to the muscles. All right, and you start to jerk, your back brain stuff too, you breathe in, and then you can't get breath because nothing's working the way it's supposed to. Your limbs start to jerk, and so you're going to end up in the rigor in a spasmodic position. The second is a grin, a sardonic death grin known as cyanide rictus. The mouth muscles draw back into this tight grin. It's not present on any picture where I can see a face. Dr. Mutu looked at the bodies and he said that 80 to 90% were forcibly injected, broken needles, evidence of forcible injection, in the back of their left shoulder blade with something. The rest, he said, were shot or strangled. The Guineas grand jury on site, Matthews Ridge, based on his testimony and the direct evidence, said that there was not a single suicide at Jonestown.
Pretty interesting, huh? You only need to pick at the MK Ultra scab to see that mind control is very real and very effective. But let's look at a more recent example that some of you may be familiar with. I mentioned this in one of the first episodes of this show, and this is Matthias Desmet, a Belgian clinical psychologist and professor of clinical psychology. Now, Desmet got a lot of attention starting in 2021 by associating the public reaction to COVID with mass formation. And here are some clips I put together to summarize his theory and observations.
For me, that was the strangest thing, that even at the moment that it became clear that the initial models had been dramatically overestimating the dangerousness of the virus, the corona narrative and the corona measures continued as if the initial models were right, which is very strange, of course, because we were facing a narrative, a mainstream narrative, which claimed to be based on science and on mathematical modeling. So you would expect that if the mathematical models prove dramatically wrong, that then the narrative would change and that the corona measures would be changed. But no, the narrative continued as if the initial models were right. But the United Nations warned us from the beginning, I think in March or April 2020, in the first weeks of the crisis, that probably more people would die because of hunger in the developing countries as a consequence of the lockdowns than the number of victims the virus could claim in the worst case scenario, even if no measures were taken at all. And in one way or another, this didn't have an impact, and this didn't make us change the strategy to deal with the coronavirus, which, of course, is extremely strange. And that was one of the reasons why, or that one of the things that I felt that should be studied in a psychological way. I tried to understand what was happening in a population, in the world, in a society, that in one way or another, we were so blind for very important aspects of reality. Is that indeed, in one way or another, if you didn't buy into the narrative, if you didn't want to go along with the narrative, or if you tried to just say something critical about the narrative, then people indeed blamed you of showing lack of solidarity and lack of citizenship.
Yes.
And I think that is extremely typical for the psychological dynamic and the psychological process that I have been describing, the process of mass formation.
Yeah.
Which exactly, when a mass emerges in a society, then a new kind of solidarity emerges, and a new social bond. And this new solidarity and new social bond is radically intolerant to dissident voices. So it's very typical of this process of mass formation I have been referring to and that I have been describing. Masses or crowds is another word, a crowd or a mass, have existed as long as humanity exists. But during the last 3 centuries, they became increasingly strong. And this has to do with the industrialization and also the industrialization of the world, and also with our materialist, rationalist view on man and the world. So that are the real causes of why mass formation becomes increasingly strong and lasts longer throughout the last 3 centuries.
If this has any validity, do you think our controllers know about it? Do you think the secret societies, the councils, and the think tanks they're members of, that they lead and they support, do any work in these fields? Or that they hire people to do that research for them?
The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses. Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses.
Think that's just a bunch of BS about marketing and doesn't impact you? How about these from 3 former presidents of the United States? Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So a question, how would it impact your psyche if you discovered credible information showing that one of these systems that you were highly engaged in had significantly, perhaps entirely, different goals, philosophies, history, etc. than you thought? How would you deal with that? Could you handle it? Or would you either dismiss it or just not pay attention to it because it would be too disruptive to the things you're focused on? Would you become curious to learn more? Would it cause you to recognize that other systems could be entirely different than you believed? Most importantly, could it cause you to wonder how you came to be so fooled? To start a journey of learning about yourself, about the human condition, that could also give you intellectual self-defense, and most importantly, to prevent you from being fooled again. Now I want to move into another topic related to systems of control, and that is the psychological makeup of both its leaders and its followers. Common among these systems of control is the presence of psychopathy, or sociopathy is a current term. So from the good old Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of psychopath is one affected with psychopathy, a mentally deranged person. Then we look at psychopathy. And we have two components here. Mental disease or disorder. Mental disorder considered apart from cerebral disease. And then secondly, the treatment of disease by psychical influences, e.g. by hypnotism. Now that was a fairly limited definition, but we know through research and what we're currently learning is that psychopaths, sociopaths, have a lack of empathy. They lack conscience. They're very skilled at manipulation. They have the appearance of outward benevolence, and they are superficially charming. So these are all characteristics that we see in psychopaths. In layman's terms, a psychopath has no restraint. They have no brakes, no guardrails. They do not have the moral infrastructure that most people do, and that is precisely why so many people struggle with accepting that these people exist, and, most importantly, that psychopaths are naturally drawn to preoccupations and organizations that promote authority and control. So the high-level leaders are typically born psychopaths, but there is another type within these organizations. They were not born that way and may have only adopted psychopathic behavior later in life. And these are the foot soldiers who, over time, lose their morality. They lose their ability to and interest in doing the work of being able to properly engage their thoughts and emotions to create just action. The process of degrading these people into that condition is accomplished through, you guessed it, mind control. And this is yet another example of the very dangerous tendency that I've talked about, that we have to outsource essential elements of our experience in exchange for comfort and perceived security. People say, no, I don't need to do that because there is an authority that claims jurisdiction over what is right or wrong through its written man-made laws. I'll gladly accept your money and I'll commit to following your orders, moral or immoral. So I'll say it again. Look no further than the military and law enforcement for the examples of that sad trade-off. And isn't it interesting? The two main groups that we're borderline harassed to support, if we're good Americans, what are they? Surprise, surprise, military and law enforcement. Something we're hearing about more and more is the effect of chronic reptilian brain engagement. This is an increasingly frequent situation where individuals come to misinterpret events and apply the fight, flight, freeze response improperly rather than engaging the other components of their brain. So little Johnny doesn't get into the preschool that would guarantee his ascent into the hallowed ground of the law or investment banking or pharmaceutical development or some other worthy endeavor, right? And mommy and daddy treat the news as a mortal threat rather than engaging their neocortex, the human thinking brain, for an appropriate response. And what groups are constantly exposed to situations that trigger that survival, fight, flight, freeze portion of the brain? Military and law enforcement. Now, I have no problem at all calling these groups out because, as I've explained before, those actually performing the acts, the individual cops and the individual soldiers, are more morally culpable and bear more responsibility for what occurs than those who devise the plans and give the orders, because it's the individuals doing the action who are the ones that bring it into existence. But it's also unfair to criticize them without taking a hard look at where the support comes from that allows them to continue doing what they do. And that, my friends, is from the bulk of the public, where authority and control are glorified. No taking a knee here for any reason. And as a quick aside for those who might not be fond of my comments about the military, how do you feel about this? So this is an article that I just saw in the Epoch Times and wanted to read you a portion of it. The family of one of the 13 fallen U.S. Marines in the 2021 Afghanistan withdrawal was asked to pay $60,000 to transfer her body to Arlington National Cemetery, according to her family. Representative Corey Mills, Republican Florida, was the first to make this known after contacting the fallen Marine Corps Sergeant Nicole G's family, Fox reported. Mr. Mills told Fox that he was, quote, enraged to learn that the Department of Defense had placed a heavy financial burden on Guy's family. Now this is really interesting. Because of a change in legislation, the Department of Defense is no longer obliged to pay for the transfer of fallen service members, according to Mills' office. Kristen Shamblin, G's mother-in-law, told Fox that the DoD paid to transfer her body to Sacramento, California, G's place of residence and recruitment station, where services were held. When G's family wanted to transfer her body to Arlington National Cemetery, they learned that the cost was $60,000, according to G's husband. And a final word on how these systems of control operate. Let's contrast what the average person pays attention to, what they do with their time, versus those within these systems. To me, the average person fits into one of two broad categories depending on their circumstances. And the first is they're either scraping by and preoccupied with the essentials, and I'm talking food, shelter, clothing, or this other camp, and these people to a greater or lesser extent have the basic necessities covered, and they spend their free time caught up in one or more of those systems I talked about in the last episode, and it's all those things we're told that will make us happy, right? Stuff, entertainment, physical comfort and pleasure, travel, food, money, and status. But those participating in systems of control, especially their leadership, aren't focused on those distractions. They're extremely dedicated and always at work furthering their goals. Now, there are no lack of negative things to say about them, but you can't call them lazy or dumb. Above all, these people are highly motivated. We're going to close this one up with a book excerpt in just a minute, but before we get there, some final thoughts on something I've been thinking about recently. Now, this goes back to a topic I touched on before, but I want to spend more time on, and that is the nature and character of basically everything. People, systems, positions, institutions, mindsets, belief systems, it really doesn't matter. Sure, we can evaluate the particular actions, the specific behavior of groups or institutions, but what insight, if any, do we gain when we evaluate their nature and character? When we limit ourselves to specifics, so for simplicity, Trump did this, or Biden did that, or Congress passed this law or didn't pass that law, we end up with a very limited perspective. And this shows up in the sad and highly uninteresting dialogue we typically see about them. Everything that's talked about is circumstantial and only has meaning for a given time. It's squabbling about minutia. I see an analogy here to truth and solipsism. Trying to understand the truth or the truth about something or someone seems very akin to me to exploring its nature and character by looking at the entirety of it. Solipsism, on the other hand, makes the examination through the lens of a specific time and place. Oh, that was a great law because at that particular time we were faced with whatever it was. And remember, solipsism is best described as perception as reality, meaning the mindset of one person at one point in time considering only their specific set of circumstances. I believe when we are able to examine nature and character, we can really see those all-important patterns I mentioned earlier. Not making an assessment based on individual incidents, but on the whole of that person or thing's existence. I won't belabor this much, but I will leave it for now. Hopefully that gives you some background, though, on my interest in that method of evaluation and why I'll be bringing it up in future shows. But I will leave you with this question. What do you believe to be the nature and character of a system that accepts the ultimate sacrifice from someone in its name and then does what it did in that Epoch Times article that I read to you? Okay, so here's an excerpt from a book titled The Esoteric Path to a New Life by Vernon Howard, and it touches on a number of ideas we've been exploring. So Vernon Howard is someone new to me, and here's some background on him. Howard was an American spiritual teacher, author, and philosopher. He began speaking on the principles of personal development in the late 1950s while living in Southern California. In the 1960s, he began writing books that focused on spiritual and psychological growth. These writings emphasized the importance and practice of self-awareness. By the 1970s, he had moved to Boulder City, Nevada, and had begun teaching spiritual development classes after being contacted by numerous individuals interested in his writings. Recognizing psychic sleep. Psychic sleep is the cause of every human problem and disaster. It is sleeping people who suffer from heartache and loneliness, from fear and violence. Only self-awakening can end those sorrows. However, and please emphasize this point in your mind, man does not know he is asleep. So deep is his immersion in psychic hypnosis that he instantly denies his actual condition. In other words, he does not know that he does not know. He spends his entire life under the gigantic illusion of being happy and productive, never once facing the terror in which he lives. Man huddles fearfully in a haunted house, which he calls a castle. Have you ever been in a room full of people when someone behaved foolishly or childishly? You sense that he did not know how he appeared to others. In fact, he may have believed he was behaving cleverly or courageously. Everyone in the room saw him as he really was, except the man himself. That is a perfect example of human hypnosis, of psychic unawareness. The ancient philosopher Socrates provided a classic illustration of man's mental sleep. He told about a group of men who were huddled together in a deep cave. Their only light was a fire that blazed in the center of the cavern. The fire cast strange shadows against the wall of the cave, frightening the prisoners, so the men sat there in terror and confusion. One of the prisoners made up his mind to explore the cave. When doing so, he found a secret tunnel. Following it all the way, he finally found himself in the outer world of sunshine and beauty. We will now look at a chief characteristic of spiritual sleep. When this is understood, all the pieces of life fall into place, revealing the whole picture. Man has a false idea of who he is. He has an illusory sense of identity. This false self is manufactured out of self-flattering imaginations and out of self-pleasing labels. He labels himself as a successful man, or as an intelligent thinker, or as a human being with lofty motives. But these are mere ideas he has about himself, and he is not these ideas. We can easily prove this. Whenever a man feels depressed or irritated, it is simply because his false identity seems not to be confirmed. Both these reactions are false, so man is their slave. Have you ever noticed how nervous people get when their pet ideas are challenged? Let this be a clue for you. By patient self-investigation, we discover who we are not, and that ends the anxiety of knowing who we are. To summarize this vital point, man wrongly believes that he possesses a separate self, an individual ego. This false idea causes fear, loneliness, and neurosis. It throws him into conflict with other people who are also under the illusion of having separate selves. No man is apart from the whole, from the all. Man is one with the universe. Human beings are like dozens of ponds, each reflecting the light from the same moon. This is not philosophy. This is fact. So thanks for being with me. Next time we're going to continue to dive further into the subject of mind control. And until then, always remember to do your own thinking. Thanks and be well.